ashes of a falling road, a little closer than you've ever known, when you're having your dreams driven into the ground.
1000 HP. It is the second album by Godsmack to be produced by Dave Fortman, and I would say it's surprisingly good, even much more good than I remembered it being, as this was the second Godsmack album I listened to as it was released in my times as an adolescent. And this really surprised me too when I got to this part of the list, because just by looking at this album's title and cover, I thought this would be the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And in all fairness, it kind of is at some points. But even so, the more negative aspects of this album really aren't that bad, or they're not the worst thing in the world, especially compared to what we've heard earlier. I would say the worst thing about 1000 HP is once again Godsmack's bizarre creative choices. Probably the best example of this is the title track, 1000 HP. I think the album is supposed to be called 1000 Horsepower, but I'm gonna call it 1000 HP just because that's what I'm gonna call it. 1000 Horsepower, 1000 Horsepower, fuck. 1000 Horsepower is a stupid and obnoxious radio rock song. Metal Sucks once did a review on the Another Animal album, and one thing the reviewer highlighted was how Whitfield Crane approaches Godsmack's music compared to the way Sully Erna does. He talks about how Whitfield Crane approaches his lyrics from a more classy standpoint, a more self-aware standpoint, and it's something that builds upon these songs, which would otherwise be just generic rock songs with lesser lyrics. Whitfield Crane had that touch that would make them more interesting. He said, the reviewer, if Sully Erna sang over this exact same song, it would probably just be him on a motorcycle talking about how cool he is. 1000 Horsepower or 1000 HP is living proof of that reviewer's statement, being as this song is literally just talking about how cool Godsmack is. I mean, I would say this is like total proof of lacking self-awareness, because 1000 Horsepower or 1000 HP is just Godsmack talking about how hard and how fast they are. And what's funny is you compare this song to the final song by Another Animal, Fall of Rome. That song's lyrics are about the Middle East. It's about the civilians of the Middle East being oppressed by their government, by their local politicians who are failing to treat them as people. They're just beating them down. It's just an interesting contrast. Fall of Rome, if you haven't heard it, check it out. It's the song we're using in this video. It's basically the Rock Guy theme. And I've also uploaded the song in full to my channel. But even so, I know I'm being very hard on 1000 HP, but it's a very playful Godsmack song, and I will give him credit. In some ways, it's kind of them winking to their critics, like basically saying, yeah, we know. It's like semi-self-aware. It's almost Godsmack acknowledging that they're really not that important to the scene, in a way a band like Metallica or Alice in Chains is. I remember liking that song back then when it came out, and upon re-listening to it, I still kind of like it. The cliches do not stop from here though. FML is another example. I mean, FML, gee, I wonder what that stands for. But regardless of this obvious trope, FML is a good song, and it continues the energy set by 1000 HP. Something Different is also borderline self-aware. It's really funny that they would put this song right after the first two tracks, which are nothing different. But even so, I like Something Different a lot. It's a very good Godsmack song. It's one of the better ones they've ever done. I do think it adds a lot to their career. I think this could actually be a Godsmack staple, if for nothing else, how unique it is. In many ways, Something Different is kind of what they were trying to go on the album for, and succeeding at it. They're achieving actually making something different in a way that retains what makes Godsmack Godsmack, but also grows their sound. It also features a brief violin solo after the first chorus, which is pretty cool. It shows how Sully Erna's solo work is seeping into Godsmack's sound, and I give him props for that, because this enhances the song. It takes it to a level it needs to be. It doesn't detract from it in any way, shape, or form. Musically, the album is actually very good. I would say a lot of the problems on The Oracle still kind of exist here. What's Next is a good example of a song that's musically good, but held back by Sully Erna's tacky lyrics. Generation Day is the best song on the album and might be in my top 5 favorite Godsmack songs. Generation Day is a continuation of what I said about Love, Hate, Sex, Pain, and What If, where the band is basically pushing themselves as songwriters, and they made something very interesting with Generation Day. And what's neat about Generation Day, when compared to a lot of the songs by Godsmack that I don't like, is it puts into context what Godsmack would sound like if they abbreviated some of their music. Because I imagine I wouldn't think much of Generation Day as a song if it was a much shorter song. If they made it for radio, if they cut all the good parts of it out. Being that Generation Day is this gradual build where the song just builds upon more energy as it continues, I couldn't imagine it being neutered by just being cut short. And it makes me wonder how many Godsmack songs I've hated would be much better if they were just longer songs, if they had another interesting part to them. The jam session on Generation Day right after the solo is one of my favorite moments by Godsmack ever. And it just shows how much chemistry these guys have with each other. Even amidst all the garbage, these guys have a natural synergy and vibe to them as musicians, and they're capable of achieving that. This late into their career, they're still capable of making interesting music when they push themselves and when they want to be interesting. I also accredit Dave Fortman for bringing this out of them. Locked and Loaded is basically Godsmack's interpretation of Before the Fall by Another Animal, and that's pretty interesting too. It's basically the same thing I mentioned earlier about The Enemy and Amends, where it's just two guys interpreting the same song but in a different way. Just when I was about to lose interest in Locked and Loaded, I will admit it's saved by the chorus. That really stepped in and made the song good for me. Once again, the lyrics are some of the weakest aspect of this album. In a way that's more notable than on The Oracle. I feel like Sully Erna was actually making good lyrics on that album, and on 1000 HP, it's almost like he took a step backwards. Living in the Gray is a good song. It's an ironic song, because ultimately that's what Godsmack does. They just live in the gray. I wouldn't say they're the best band in the world or they're the worst band in the world. They're just very gray. This song's almost like an indirect nod about that, like how this band is just very stale sometimes. The lyrics are topical, but Tony Rambola gets an interesting solo on this song, and ultimately that makes it interesting and good to me as well. Turning to Stone is a good song as well, as I really want to say Shannon Larkin and Sully Erna are splitting the percussion duties on this song. It's like they're both playing their respective drum interpretation of Turning to Stone, and it makes it good. I know Sully Erna is a drummer, and as I understand it, he oversees a lot of Shannon Larkin's drumming to make sure it fits in line with his vision of Godsmack. But this is one example of it succeeding and enhancing the song, making it more interesting, and showing off two very talented drummers basically dueling off of each other, just like they do for their live performances. It's not as interesting as Generation Day, but it's a nice closer. So upon finishing this album, it's very similar to The Oracle, even the colors, but I would say I mostly barely enjoy it a little bit more. Lyrically, it's much worse than The Oracle, but a lot of the problems I had with The Oracle are corrected on 1000 HP. And that's in the music. The music tends to really save a lot of the lyrical weaker points on this album from being too boring or ruining the song for me. However, it's still not as good as Faceless, and there's a few times where the band is basically holding each other back. Dull lyrics expose dull music and vice versa. While I did highlight points during the listening of this album where the musicians managed to pull a song out from the dirt just as Sully Erna is about to ruin it with his cliches and topical writing. Even so, that doesn't happen every time. I would say I enjoyed this record a lot more than I expected to. I think it's one of the better albums by Godsmack, and a lot of this has to do with Dave Fortman. I really do think he speaks to these guys on a level that they need to be spoken to, and he knows how to really make them shine. I did enjoy this album more than I expected to, and I do think it's a step closer to what Godsmack is capable of. I feel like a lot of my criticisms are being harsh here. Dave Fortman is a very important member of Godsmack as a producer, and he is bringing Godsmack closer to what they need to be. 1000 HP is very good. It's not great, but it's very good. And I would say this is the closest they've come so far to matching the energy and consistency they found on Faceless. It's good. It's not great, but it's good nonetheless.